Hello. In this clip from our Justia webinar, Lynn Garson, attorney and mental health advocate, talks about how to identify stress in law practice, stresses specific to lawyers, and the difference between stress and burnout. If you want to see more Justia videos on law practice and legal marketing, be sure to subscribe to our channel.
So now, identifying stress in law practice. Here we are. You may have seen this. It looks old, 2016. You're like, why is she showing me something from 2016? This is the gold standard. Patrick Krill, who is the father of the mental health programming journey in this country, also has put out numerous studies and is also a consultant and does a tremendous amount of work. He, along with some others, did this study with 13,000 lawyers, as you see, in 29 states. So huge study. And this is what they came up with. So anxiety and stress, and I'm not sure how they differed between the two, but we're cranked up over 100% if you add the two together. I will also just say that this was self-reports. So this does not include people who may suffer from some of these issues but didn't report. So the numbers are higher. And this is 2016, before we ever went through COVID. I think the numbers are quite a bit higher. And if you're reading the news and watching, what's going on, if it's not you, if you've got teenage children or young adults, it's them in large measure. The numbers are beyond alarming for that part of society. And I think a large number of lawyers have children in that category. And like I said, if you're worried about a child who's in some of these states, you also are under a tremendous amount of stress. This, I think you've probably heard over and over, especially during COVID, that we were under fight or flight for 2.5 years. You're supposed to be in fight or flight mode for all of 10 seconds, while instinctively you figure out saber-toothed tiger, is the tree close enough? Is the cave closer? That's it. That's all that is supposed to be. And it was very interestingly explained to me that when we're in that mode, our prefrontal cortex, which is fight or flight, borrows from our cognitive function, because it doesn't have a cognitive function. It does not have an executive function. It's pure instinct. You need a cognitive function to decide which tree, which cave, which is closer. And that is why when we're having a big cortisol dump, we get foggy, we can't concentrate, we'll blink our eyes and look at the screen again, and it still doesn't come into focus. That's exactly why, which I thought was actually very interesting. What we do want to look at, though, is what do we do in some of these instances? And this screen talks about stress versus burnout. So if you're just having a normal response, stress can be a positive or a negative. It inspires me all the time to meet a deadline. I can tell you, if I didn't care, if I didn't get a little bit stressed out, I wouldn't do what I do. But I do, and so that's not a bad thing up to a point. Burnout and maximal stress, whole different ballgame. There's a description here of burnout. If you've ever had it, you don't really need the description. You know what it feels like, and burnout is the perfect term. There's nothing left but the ashes. You're scraping together the ashes to pull yourself together every minute, every hour, every day to respond to your demands, but it's not going to go on much longer because you are burned out. So this slide is called Stress is Specific to Lawyers. I have had this slide in this form or close to this form for years, and it never occurred to me till I was preparing for this program that these are not stresses that are specific to lawyers. These are characteristics of lawyers that lead to stress. And the bullet point pretty much says that, but the title of the slide does not. So perfectionism, okay. If you don't own it, there are a lot of us out there who should own it. If you do own it, that's good news because now we can talk about how to deal with it a little bit later in the program. What I have considered is that perfectionism coupled with the time constraints that we're under, perfect storm. You've got to do it in 5 minutes and it's got to be perfect. How much more stress could you put a person under? Most of us are overachievers, a little bit compulsive, highly competitive, skilled actors wearing the mask. Remember my first slide? By all appearances, here's what's really going on. Nobody knew. We're lawyers. Of course, we're skilled at wearing the mask. Here's one that people don't often think about, I don't think, is over-identification with the job. And the people who over-identify it will take umbrage at the fact that I even call it a job rather than the profession or the work or, a more exalted term. What it is there are people, I am not one of them, but there are many who are, that identify with this work so closely that if they fail or don't have a perfect outcome, it's not, I failed and hopefully the outcome will be better next time. I'll do, have another case in a week, hopefully a better outcome, but I'm a failure. That is a whole different ball game and it tears you down. It's an inside job, like I said at the very beginning, and that is very difficult to combat if you're inside beating yourself up, saying I'm a failure. That leads to nothing but more stress. Secondary trauma, that's not the kind of work I do. I'm a corporate type. I do healthcare law. I draft contracts for employment agreements for physicians and the like all day long. But secondary trauma is when you're dealing with cases where, abuse, for example, and it's so traumatic. The people who went through it obviously are traumatized. So are you. Secretiveness can be an element, preference to look outward, not inward, imposter syndrome. So a lot of younger lawyers talk about that, but I've been interested that if I ever bring that up in a group, older lawyers or more senior attorneys will own that as well. And that's the feeling that somebody's going to discover the wizard behind the curtain. The fact that you don't have all the answers and you might even be wrong sometimes. And that is unacceptable to some people. And that is a characteristic that will lead to a lot of stress. If you feel that being wrong is unacceptable and you've got to wear the mask and show the perfect outward appearance, but inside you're thinking, I'm an imposter. I don't know the answer. I'm going to fake it. I might fake it sometimes, but I don't know the answer. Again, how much more stress could you put yourself under? And by the way, each one of us doesn't just have one of these characteristics. Most attorneys have multiples of these characteristics. And the final one is compassion fatigue, which you can fully understand public defenders and judges. Again, not my practice, but, you get to the point, again, it's burnout. I don't have anything left. I have listened to as much painful information and had empathy for as many painful situations as I can, and I'm exhausted, and that's what that is. So if you suffer from some of these things and you're to the point of having mental distress or even being extremely stressed, not necessarily mental distress or mental health issues, how do you recognize that? We're on autopilot a lot of times. It's, that draft is due tomorrow. I'm not thinking about myself. I'm thinking about the draft. How do you identify that either you or someone, a colleague or someone is under that kind of stress? And this is a list. There are plenty of other lists you could Google out there. 95 out of 100 times, it's changes. You will notice changes in somebody's behavior. They used to be immaculate. Now they're coming to work and their hair hadn't been washed in 5 days. Their shirt isn't buttoned. They used to, anytime you went by the office and said, "Hey, let's go grab a sandwich." "Oh, yeah, yeah, let me just close out of this. I'm on my way." Now they're, "No, I'm gonna just stick with my office, stay here. I've got some things to do." Those are the tells that there is something wrong. And I will say, like I said, 95 out of 100 times, there is something wrong in those cases. What you choose to do about yourself or others is a different question. We will talk more about that. I know I keep saying that, but we will. This is a slide that I like to talk about, subtleties to watch for. So I've just talked about clear tells, the dirty shirt that hasn't been washed, that kind of thing. But there are far more subtle things to look out for. I give an example of when my family came to town right before they did help me get into Shepherd Pratt. I picked them up at the airport and I said, "I really shouldn't be driving this car." Translation, I am begging you to ask me why so I can tell you what's wrong. And nobody asked. So, I ultimately did ask my brother, but that was me in my mind, but it was subtle, asking for help. I also have a colleague, so this is much more in our field, who during COVID was just under the gun constantly and needed help. She's getting 2 to 4 hours of sleep a night for months. And she was a junior partner, and she shares this story. I'm not telling anything out of school. She went to the partner in charge of wherever she was, different office than mine, and asked for help multiple times. The problem was she put on a big old smile, can-do attitude, asked for help, and never got it. And it got to the point that she had a client, somebody was getting a deposition taken, literally melted down, is sobbing, had to be taken off the stand. And she said, "What's wrong?" And he said, "I had a stroke 6 months ago. My doctor said I shouldn't put myself under any stress." And her immediate, not a nanosecond later, thought was, "Gee, maybe if that happened to me, I could get a break." Had a stroke. She was 35. She is now 37 or 8. And she looked at herself and she said, "Something is really, really wrong. And I need to help myself now." And she did. You can read the rest of that. I'm going to move a little bit faster because I know that we've got limited time and there's a lot I want to get to. Suicide warning signs, I want to tell you 2 things. A sudden swing from hopeless to carefree is not necessarily a good sign. It can often mean that someone is at peace because they now have a plan and they know they're going to execute on it. And finally, they're not suffering anymore. They see an out. So don't think necessarily that someone who was hopeless, who's now carefree, that's a good sign. And don't necessarily think that someone who is hopeless, who then gives you their most important possession, that's a good sign either, because it may not be. Couple of myths on this order. Myth, never ask somebody if they're contemplating self-harm. It might push them over the edge. The only thing I'm going to say is no. No, period. That's not true. Ask, you might save their lives. And again, I've got a link to the article that I wrote. Another myth is that we no longer have stigma and anybody who needs help is getting it. Not true. Study, National Institute of Mental Health, 50% of people with mental illness are receiving treatment. Worldwide, it's worse. So a lot of that you might say, "Oh, well, there's no access to care. There's not enough care." True. But stigma is still so deeply embedded in the culture. As I say, it's embedded in our very language. "You're crazy. She's insane. You're driving me nuts." Sit down for 30 seconds and write down as many as you can think of. You'll be shocked.
Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this video. And if you did enjoy it, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more law practice and legal marketing videos. See you in our next clip.